My grandfather saw me holding my newborn in worn-out clothes, then he asked what happened to the $250,000 he gave me. Sometimes, the greatest betrayals aren't loud, they're quiet, meticulously planned, and executed by those closest to you. My grandfather, a man who had faced down corporate raiders and personal tragedies without a tear, finally faltered when he saw me, a new mother, wearing the same tired clothes for days. His quiet question changed everything. My grandfather had always been a man of unwavering composure. Not a single tear had escaped him at my grandmother's funeral, nor during his first heart surgery at 71. Even at my wedding, I'd only caught him blinking hard, a subtle gesture common among men of his generation who believed grief was a private affair. But 3 days after my daughter, Lily, was born, he walked into my hospital room and truly saw me. He saw the identical shirt I'd been wearing since Tuesday, the dark circles etched beneath my eyes, the involuntary flinch when the nurse mentioned the bill. Then, something I'd never witnessed before happened. His chin trembled, just once, before he sternly locked it back down. "Olivia," he said, his voice a quiet murmur as he pulled a chair close, settling into it as if his legs had suddenly remembered their age. "Wasn't $250,000 a month enough?" I thought I'd misheard him. "What? The money?" His tone was cautious, measured. "I've been sending it every month since your wedding day, without fail. I wanted you to be comfortable, to never have to work." He looked at my hands, roughened from the night shifts I'd taken cleaning offices, starting when I was 6 months pregnant, just to keep the electricity on. I assumed you were choosing to live simply." Lily was asleep on my chest, 8 pounds, 4 ounces. 2 days old, and already the most real thing in my world. "Grandpa," my voice came out wrong, too small, "I've never seen a single dollar." The color drained from his face. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, he pulled out his phone, dialed a single contact, and when the call connected, he uttered 4 words, "Get me Eleanor. Now." Just as the door swung open. "My name is Olivia Reed. I'm 29, and up until 72 hours ago, I would have confidently told you I had a firm grasp on my own life's trajectory. I grew up with my grandfather, Elias Thorne, my mother's father, after my parents passed away in a car accident when I was 9. He raised me in his Savannah home, a stately old place with sweeping wraparound porches and far too many rooms, its kitchen always smelling of the housekeeper's warm biscuits. Elias was old Georgia money, the kind who wore the same watch for 40 years and never once mentioned its true value. He managed a private equity firm from a downtown office, his reputation so formidable that people instinctively straightened their backs at the mention of his name. He never, not once in 20 years, made me feel like a burden. It turned out he'd also been quietly depositing $250,000 every month into an account I'd never even known existed. I met Daniel Hayes at a charity gala 3 years prior. He was charming, a finance guy, the sort of handsome that somehow improves in person. He had a knack for laughing at all the right moments and remembering small details I'd mentioned weeks earlier, a skill, I now understand, rather than a genuine quality. We dated for 8 months, and he proposed at the very restaurant where we'd had our first dinner. My grandfather liked him. That mattered to me, perhaps too much. Elias was an astute judge of character, except, it seemed, when that character was meticulously performing just for him. The warning signs were there, I just had an incredibly efficient system for dismissing them. The joint account Daniel suggested we open, into which he promptly funneled all my income, seemed pragmatic at the time. His handling of all our finances, claiming he was simply better with numbers, felt like a sensible division of labor. The way our grocery budget steadily shrank while his wardrobe seemed to expand. The way I found myself mentally calculating prices on restaurant menus while he never appeared to give it a second thought. The way he began referring to my grandfather's wealth as something we would eventually have access to. I convinced myself each instance was trivial, a quirk, a temporary imbalance, the natural friction of blending 2 lives. Then I became pregnant. Money grew tight, fast. Daniel grew distant. The small imbalances started to pile up. I took on a second job at 6 months pregnant, 2 overnight shifts a week cleaning office buildings, because our checking account was dangerously low, and I couldn't bear the constant anxiety. I didn't tell Elias. I was ashamed, believing it was a problem Daniel and I alone had to solve. Daniel knew about the cleaning job, he even called it industrious. Once, he brought me a smoothie as I prepared for a shift, kissed my forehead, and said he was proud. $8 million sat in an account bearing his name. I didn't know that yet. The first thing that caught my attention was the Amazon packages. This was around my 4th month of pregnancy. Daniel's mother, Serena, had started spending more time at our house. She lived 40 minutes away and seemed to possess a schedule entirely malleable to impromptu visits. She and Daniel shared a closeness that often made me feel like an outsider in my own life. Serena held strong opinions about everything in our home, including my kitchen organization, which she voiced as helpful observations, in a tone that implied disagreement was a form of ingratitude. The packages arrived daily, mostly addressed to Daniel, though some bore Serena's name. Mostly clothes, high-end brands I recognized but couldn't afford. I mentioned it once, gently, I thought, and Daniel replied that he'd been performing well with a portfolio and was simply treating himself a little. He said it with the kind of casual confidence that immediately closed the conversation. That Friday, I went to my cleaning shift. Mopped 12 floors, and told myself I believed him. The second thing I noticed was the vacation. Daniel and Serena flew to Napa for a long weekend during my 7th month of pregnancy. I didn't go, I was exhausted, swollen, and honestly preferred the comfort of our couch. Daniel sent photos, a sleek rental car, a sun-drenched vineyard, a restaurant with flickering candles, white tablecloths, and a wine list that conspicuously lacked prices. The photos look beautiful, I told him. Just a week earlier, I'd politely declined the hospital's premium birthing suite because we couldn't afford the upgrade fee. Staring at the vineyard photo, I thought, *, he must have a portfolio I don't know about. He must be doing better than I realize. I should ask him about it, *, I never did. The third thing, the moment the ground truly crumbled beneath me, happened the day I came home from the hospital. We'd been there for 3 days, myself, Daniel, and our daughter, Lily, who had arrived pink and furious and immediately indispensable. The hospital parking cost $28 a day. I knew this because I'd checked. I knew it because I was constantly doing that kind of grinding, low-grade financial math, an anxiety that had become so familiar I no longer consciously noticed it, like a perpetual background hum. Elias had come to meet Lily on day 2. He'd held her for 20 silent minutes, the most tender gesture I'd ever witnessed from him. Then he'd looked at me, at my shirt, at my eyes, and asked his question. And my entire life abruptly rearranged itself. The hospital room door opened, and Daniel walked in first, followed by Serena. They were laughing about something, Serena's arm looped with 4 shopping bags, Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, and a small boutique I didn't recognize, tissue paper peeking from the top. Daniel carried 2 more. They were mid-sentence, still smiling, radiating the casual ease of people who experienced excellent days constantly. Then they saw Elias's face, and the laughter ceased. Not gradually, but instantly. Elias, Serena said, her voice becoming careful, controlled. What a nice surprise. My grandfather didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on Daniel. Daniel, he said, just his name. Quiet. Like a door closing before a storm. Daniel placed the shopping bags on the floor. His smile was performing a death it hadn't yet been informed of. Hey, Elias. Didn't know you were stopping by. Where has my granddaughter's money gone? The room fell into that specific silence of held breath. Lily, who had been softly fussing for the past few minutes, stopped too, as if even she understood the enormity unfolding. Daniel blinked. What money? Don't. Elias's voice dropped to a register I'd never heard from him before. Not anger, anger is loud. This was colder. Every payment went into a joint account designated for Olivia's household expenses. An account your name appeared on as co-manager. An account she never had independent access to. I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Things were complicated, he stammered. Financially, the market, 3 years, I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant, as if from another room. 3 years of wire transfers. $250,000 a month. I did the math aloud, needing to hear it. That's $8 million. The number hung in the room like a physical object. You told me we were tight, I said. I picked up a cleaning job at 6 months pregnant, Daniel. I cried over a grocery bill. I apologized to my grandfather for not visiting more because I couldn't afford the gas. My hands were shaking. I didn't try to stop them. And you were sitting on $8 million. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't guilt. Not exactly. It was something far worse, the calculating gaze of someone reassessing. You don't understand what it takes to maintain our position. Whose position? My voice cracked on the word. Serena stepped forward, her chin lifted in that familiar way she adopted when assembling her authority. Daniel's career requires a certain presentation. His network, his client entertainment, his career, Elias interjected, cutting her off with the precise skill of a man who had done so in boardrooms for 50 years, is about to be the least of his problems. Daniel dropped the pretense. He just let it fall. Fine. His voice went flat and cold, in a way I'd never heard before. Like something ugly underneath the charm had finally surfaced. Fine. Yes, I used it. Because I earned it. You have no idea what I do, what I manage, what it takes to. Stop talking, Elias said. Daniel stopped. Just like that, as if the command had short-circuited something vital. Pack a bag, Elias said to me. He hadn't raised his voice once. You and Lily are coming home with me tonight. My attorneys will handle the rest. Serena grabbed his arm, her composure visibly fracturing in her eyes, in the tendons of her neck. Elias, please. You'll destroy him. He has a reputation, a career, people who depend on him. If you do this, he looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. He robbed his pregnant wife, Elias said. He can keep whatever reputation survives that. She let go. By 11 o'clock that night, Lily and I were in my old bedroom at Elias's house in Savannah. It was exactly as I'd left it when I got married, same quilt, same lamp, same view of the ancient oak tree I'd climbed countless times as a child. I sat on the edge of the bed with Lily on my chest, feeling the profound exhaustion of someone who had been unknowingly carrying an enormous burden for a very long time. The next morning, Elias introduced me to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was 57, silver-haired, and had served as Elias's lead attorney for 15 years. She wore sharp charcoal suits and spoke with the focused economy of someone who billed by the hour and considered small talk a waste of precious time. She held a law degree from Yale, and Elias later told me, had never lost a civil fraud case. She sat across from me at Elias's dining room table, a folder thick enough to serve as a weapon resting before her. Tell me everything, she instructed. Start at the beginning. Don't editorialize. I spoke for 40 minutes. She took notes without looking up, asked 3 clarifying questions, and when I finished, she said, good. Now let me tell you what we already have. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 years of wire transfer records, every payment dated and timestamped, flowing from Elias's account into the joint household account, and then, within 72 hours of each deposit, routed in partial amounts to a second, private account solely in Daniel's name at a bank in Delaware. Elias first noticed irregularities in the payment confirmations and called me, she explained. She turned a page. There's also a third account, offshore, in the Cayman Islands. Approximately $1.2 million moved there over 18 months. The number landed like a second punch after the first had already knocked me down. She continued, detailing credit card statements showing Serena Hayes as an authorized user on one of Daniel's private cards. $12,000 spent in a single month, luxury hotels, restaurants, a high-end jeweler in Atlanta, a receipt for a weekend trip to the Bahamas, all while I was in my second trimester, telling my OB I needed to delay a test because of the copay. Then she produced the last item. This one, she said, is the piece that makes everything else unnecessary. She slid a printed transcript across the table, a conversation with timestamps, pulled from the cloud backup of Serena's Amazon Echo. The smart speaker in her kitchen had logged it automatically. Daniel's voice, then Serena's, then Daniel's again. Asterisk, she'll never find out. Old Elias trusts me completely. And if he does find out, Olivia will take my side. She always does. Asterisk, I read it twice. My vision blurred at the edges. Are you all right? Eleanor asked. Keep going, I managed. She outlined the plan: fraud, financial abuse under Georgia domestic statute, civil theft. They would file in the morning, and at the exact moment the papers were served, 9 a.m. sharp, her office would dispatch a press release to 3 major financial news wires. I looked up from the folder. Why the press release? Because Daniel closed a 7-figure investor deal last Tuesday, Eleanor explained, a venture capital group out of Atlanta. $3.4 million committed, with a second tranche pending. She folded her hands on the table. Those investors have a right to know the character of the man they've put their money behind. My heart hammered. Will it hold up? The transcript alone would hold up. The financial records are ironclad. The offshore account will involve a separate federal conversation, which is not our filing. That call has already been made to the appropriate agency. She closed the folder. By noon tomorrow, every phone in Daniel Hayes's life will be ringing. And for the first time in 3 years, he won't have an answer for any of them. That night, I sat in my grandfather's kitchen at 1:30 a.m., Lily in the bassinet beside me, a cup of tea I'd stopped tasting growing cold. I thought about the version of myself who had mopped floors at 6 months pregnant, who had felt grateful for the extra shift. I thought about how shame works, how it quietly infiltrates, making you believe the problem is uniquely yours to solve. The financial anxiety, the grocery math, the borrowed maternity clothes I told myself were fine, were temporary, were just part of building a life. I had been so careful not to ask Elias for help, so careful not to appear unable to manage things, so proud of what I believed was my own self-sufficiency. It wasn't self-sufficiency. It was being looted so skillfully that I didn't even realize I was bleeding. Daniel called 7 times that night. I watched his name appear and vanish on my screen, feeling nothing but a bone-deep weariness. He was still calling the next morning when Eleanor sent me a single text at 9:02 a.m., served. I put the phone down and looked at Lily's tiny fingers wrapped around mine. At 9:47, Serena called. I could hear her screaming before I even brought the phone to my ear, so I held it away and watched Lily's eyelashes instead. Voicemail. At 10:15, Eleanor texted again, * lead investor called, pulling out both tranches. $3.4 million gone before lunch, * at 10:52, a financial journalist named Marcus Chen, a byline at the Atlanta Business Chronicle and 15 years covering Southeast markets, called my grandfather directly. He'd received the press release. He had questions. Elias referred him to Eleanor, who, I later learned, was already on a second call with the Associated Press. At 11:58, Daniel's name illuminated my screen. I stared at it for the full length of the ring. Then I placed my phone face down on the table and made more tea. The weeks that followed had the strange quality of an aftermath, everything raw and still, like a landscape after a storm. I was healing from childbirth and a marriage simultaneously, a particular kind of exhaustion for which I know no name. Daniel's attempts to reach me cycled through stages with a predictability that would have been almost clinical if it hadn't been my actual life. First, calls and texts, dozens of them, ranging from apologetic to explanatory, eventually becoming entitled, * you need to hear my side, * you're being manipulated by your grandfather, * you're going to regret this, * I read them the way one reads a weather report for a place they're not going, informative, not personal. His lawyer sent letters. Eleanor sent them back, each time with slightly more documentation attached, which I understood was her way of communicating that we possessed more material than they had anticipated, and she was enjoying making that clear incrementally. Then Daniel made the mistake that changed everything. He attended his company's quarterly charity dinner, one of those black tie affairs where the actual charity component is roughly 15% of the evening, and networking makes up the other 85%. His investors, his partners, his professional network, all in one room. He'd apparently decided that offense was the best defense, because he stood up in front of 200 people and declared that his wife had suffered a postpartum breakdown and abandoned him, that she had taken his daughter without cause, and that she had turned his grandfather-in-law against him. Out of spite. 200 people. Among them, 4 of my grandfather's business partners, 3 longtime friends from his club, and the wife of his lead attorney from a separate firm. By 7:30 the next morning, I had 12 voicemails from people I'd met over the years at Elias's dinners and gatherings. People I'd always perceived as politely distant, because I was younger, because I was just the granddaughter, who were now calling to say they'd heard what Daniel had said and wanted me to know they were available to speak on my behalf, to testify if needed, to help in any way they could. The 12th voicemail was from a woman named Beatrice Carmichael, 81 years old, who had known my grandfather for 40 years and apparently held very specific opinions about men who publicly lied about their wives. Tell Eleanor to call me, she'd instructed. I have a long memory and a large address book, and I've been waiting for an excuse to use both. I played that one for Eleanor, who smiled in a way I hadn't seen before. Beatrice Carmichael, she said. Good. You know her? She's been on the board of 3 major charitable foundations for 30 years. She has relationships with every journalist and donor in a 200-mile radius. Eleanor opened a new document on her laptop. Daniel just made a serious error in venue selection. The defamation angle was added to our filing that afternoon. Eleanor contacted Marcus Chen at the Business Chronicle, who had already been developing his piece and was now, I was told, expanding it from a single article to a 3-part series. The hearing for the emergency protective order took place 17 days after Lily was born. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, efficient, the kind of room that processes human damage on an industrial scale without losing its procedural calm. Presiding was Judge Evelyn Albright, who had served on the Chatham County bench for 11 years and possessed, according to Eleanor, a particular and well-documented impatience for financial abuse cases where the documentation was clear and the defendant had chosen audacity over contrition. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Arthur Sterling, who wore a very good suit and the expression of someone who had already reviewed the evidence and was mentally moving on to his next case. Eleanor presented Exhibit A through Exhibit M, wire transfers, account records, the Delaware account, the Cayman account, the credit card statements, the Echo transcript. Arthur Sterling objected twice. Judge Albright sustained neither objection. When it was Daniel's turn, Arthur made an argument about the complexity of financial management in high-net-worth situations, the nature of marital accounts, and the question of consent. It was technically coherent. It also offered no counter to Exhibit G, the transcript, or Exhibit L, the offshore account documentation that a federal investigator named Detective Robert Evans from the IRS Financial Crimes Unit had by that point independently flagged and was pursuing on a separate but parallel track. Judge Albright granted the emergency order. She also made a comment from the bench, which Eleanor later told me was unusual. Judges typically keep their observations purely procedural, about the calculated and sustained nature of the financial control evidenced in the record. Daniel didn't look at me when we filed out. I hadn't expected him to, but I noticed it anyway. The Business Chronicle piece ran on a Thursday. Marcus Chen's byline appeared above the fold, digitally titled, "The Other Account, How a Savannah Finance Manager Redirected $8 million in Family Funds Over 3 Years." It was careful, thoroughly sourced, and specific. It named the Delaware account. It named the Cayman account. It quoted 3 investors who had either exited or frozen their relationship with Daniel's firm. It included a statement from Eleanor on my behalf and a statement from Arthur Sterling that was 4 sentences long and essentially meaningless. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By Friday afternoon, it was featured on 3 financial news aggregators and 2 general interest outlets. Daniel's firm had 9 employees. By the following Monday, 6 of them had resigned. His mother, Serena, called me twice more during that period. The first call I let go to voicemail. The message was long and alternated between rage and pleading in a way that told me she understood, on some molecular level, that her authorized user card and the Echo transcript had done significant damage to her own position. The second call came the day after the AP pickup. And I did answer it, not because I had anything to say to her, but because I wanted to hear whether she would apologize or double down. She doubled down. Told me I was destroying a good man. Told me Daniel had only ever tried to provide for our family. Told me I owed her a conversation. "You were on his card, Serena," I said. "The one funded by the money that was supposed to pay my electric bill." She hung up. 3 months after the hearing, I was sitting on Elias's porch on a Saturday morning, Lily in my lap, my coffee growing cold on the railing beside me, when he came out and sat in the chair next to mine. We watched the street for a while, listening to the old neighborhood sounds, birds, a distant sprinkler, a child on a bicycle. "I want to tell you something," he said. I looked at him. "I should have structured it differently from the beginning. A direct account, only in your name. I trusted him because you loved him, and I used your judgment as a substitute for my own. That was my failure." "Grandpa, let me finish." He was looking at the street. "I told myself the money was a gift to your marriage, not to you specifically. That it would be managed jointly because that's how marriages work. I told myself a lot of things that were mostly excuses not to look too closely." He paused. "I'm sorry, Olivia. For the cleaning job. For the grocery bills. For every moment you felt alone in that and thought it was yours to fix." My throat tightened. "I didn't know," I said. "I know you didn't. That's what made it work." He finally looked at me. He counted on both of us not looking. We sat with that for a while. "Eleanor says the civil recovery is strong," I eventually said. "It is. Between the domestic accounts and the offshore recovery, they've frozen the Cayman account. The federal piece is moving. You'll have access to most of it eventually. Maybe 18 months. He picked up his coffee. "The rest will come from the defamation settlement. Arthur Sterling called Eleanor last week. Daniel wants to settle before discovery." She said no. "She did." Elias almost smiled. "She said discovery would be more useful than a settlement at this stage." Arthur apparently agreed pretty quickly. The AP article had mentioned the charity dinner speech. Daniel's remaining professional relationships had mostly evaporated in the 2 weeks following publication. The venture capital group had not only pulled their investment but filed their own civil complaint, adding a second front to his legal exposure. Detective Evans's federal investigation was proceeding separately, with a timeline Eleanor described as slow but inevitable. Daniel's firm had formally dissolved. He was, as of last week's legal correspondence, living in a short-term rental in Marietta and had requested a modification to the protective order to allow supervised visitation with Lily. Eleanor had responded with a counterproposal that included conditions she described to me as achievable if he's serious, and clarifying if he isn't. I didn't hate him. That surprised me more than anything. I'd expected the revelation to ignite some hot, clarifying fury I could burn through and emerge on the other side. But what I actually felt was something more akin to the absence of weight, like setting down a bag I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. I thought about the woman who had mopped floors in her third trimester and felt proud of her efficiency. Who had apologized to her grandfather for not visiting. Who had done mental math at restaurants and called it being careful. She wasn't naive. She was deceived by someone who had studied her trust and treated it as a resource. There's a difference. It took me a while to truly grasp it. 6 months after Eleanor slid that transcript across the table, I signed a lease on a small house 3 blocks from Elias's in Savannah. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen with a window over the sink that catches the morning light. I went back to work part-time. I have a background in nonprofit development, which I'd put on hold when Daniel suggested I focus on the house. I'm rebuilding that now, slowly, on my own timeline. Lily is 6 months old. She has her great-grandfather's eyes, which are gray and deliberate, and she has already figured out that if she looks at him long enough, he will eventually make a fool of himself trying to make her laugh. I don't think about Daniel every day anymore. Some weeks, I barely think about him at all, which itself feels like something recovered. Eleanor emails me updates when there are updates. The federal investigation is ongoing. The civil recovery is on track. The defamation case is moving toward trial because Daniel, true to form, apparently believes he can still win something. Arthur Sterling sends letters that Eleanor describes as increasingly fatigued. The last thing I heard directly from Daniel was a voicemail 4 months ago in which he said he wanted me to understand that he'd made mistakes, but that he'd always loved me and that he hoped I could find it in my heart eventually to forgive him for the sake of our daughter's stability. It was very well constructed. I could hear how much work had gone into it. I saved it, not for myself, but for Lily. So that when she's old enough to ask questions about her father, she can hear what he sounded like when he was performing remorse and decide for herself how much weight to give it. That's the thing about men like Daniel. They always believe the next version of themselves will be the one that finally convinces you. He said on that recording Serena's smart speaker made that I always took his side. He was right for 3 years. But the thing about always is that it only takes once to make it a lie. And I had a grandfather with a phone and a lawyer who ate lawsuits for breakfast. That was enough.